Christopher co-founded and serves full-time as the CEO and publisher at Classical Academic Press, a classical education curriculum, media, and consulting company. Christopher serves as a consultant to charter, public, private, and Christian schools across the country. He is the board vice president, and correct me if I get any of my information wrong. He's the board vice president of the Society for Classical Learning and the director of the Alcuin Fellowship of Classical Educators. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of South Carolina and his MDiv and PhD in Apologetics from Westminster Theological Seminary. He's taught at Messiah College and Chesapeake Theological Seminary and served as the founding headmaster of a classical school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for 10 years. He's the author of the book, An Introduction to Classical Education, a Guide for Parents, which is one of the required reading materials for our Sampler families. And he also co-authored Latin for Children, the Latin for Children series, which we also use in our classrooms. Our faculty has watched conference talks given by Dr. Perrin and read articles that he has written and have really been blessed and enriched by his wisdom and expertise. And we were further enriched this afternoon. He gave us a talk on learning to love what must be done, and it was excellent. Thank you. So let's please welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Christopher Perrin.
Thank you. Thank you. Perfect. So I take it this is not the Bernie Sanders rally. Should I change my talk? It is a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be here where you talk funny. I've been listening to Dan here talk about what it's like to live here, and so on. I was just in Worcester about a month ago, and someone was asking me for a pass card. And it just took me a while to get it, but I love hearing your accent. So please, just talk like you're from far north as possible, and my ears will be delighted. I am from central Pennsylvania as of the last 25 years, but originally got my start in California. It's been reported to me that I was born there. I don't really remember the experience, but that's what my parents tell me. And then my dad joined the NCIS, and it's not nearly as exciting as the TV show. We spent 11 years overseas in the Pacific Ocean, Japan, Okinawa, Guam. I'd ask for this. It's just a little mood music to get us started here. And now I'm going to do a Frank Sinatra tune. I took a trip on a train and I thought about you. So there in the, my dad never drew his gun except once, but the gun wasn't there. It wasn't even in his holster, so it was not that exciting. But I did get to travel and spent some time overseas. Then I met a girl who was from central Pennsylvania, and that's why I live there now. You meet somebody. Recognize that tune? That'll set up my next point. So I was traveling along the Susquehanna River in central Pennsylvania, and this was about 7 or 8 years ago. Kids were younger. And I was just musing on this fact that I kind of don't really have a deep sense of home. I don't feel rooted to a place in a deep way like some of you might have been born and raised in this area. And so I said to my kids, do you feel like you're from Pennsylvania? And they all said, well, yeah. And I said, but do you feel like you're from here? And there was a pause again. None of the kids said anything. And then my middle child said, yeah. And then I said, do you feel like this is your home? And then my oldest pointed across the river to the Harrisburg Hospital, and she said, Dad, I was born there. This is my home. So my kids have been raised with this. They're Pennsylvanians, and I'm still not sure quite what I am. But one thing that I have become is just a insatiable fan of the tradition of classical education. classical and Christian education because of what I've discovered about it. Aaliyah mentioned that I studied history when I was in college. And so I did a classics minor, and I got a chance to read about Greece and Rome and do a little bit of study of Latin and Greek and so forth. But I didn't know what classical education was. I read a little Cicero or something. But I didn't know really what it was. I didn't know that there was a tradition of educating the sons and daughters of the church, and really all of Western Europe, that had created a remarkable culture and civilization, and that it had been kind of maybe a combination, a fusion of what happened in Greece and Rome prior to the coming of Christ, and then this new thing that occurred when Greece and Rome met the Creator incarnate, Jesus Christ. And that's its own remarkable story. That you've heard of the glory that was Rome, the splendor that was Greece, etc. And Greek philosophy was yearning for creating human excellence, a full capacitated human being, what they called arete. And they sought to do this in their writings, in their sculptures. Have you seen some of the great Greek sculptures? Have you seen the discus thrower? It would look kind of like me if I took my shirt off. Really, not really. There are 4 Roman copies of that Greek sculpture because it was so well esteemed. Greek sculpture and architecture and literature was copied by the Romans and continued into Roman civilization. So we call it Greco-Roman civilization. But by about the time of Christ, the attempts to become this excellent man were failing, and the Greeks were growing, and the Romans weary and fatigued. It wasn't happening. And then Christ was born. Christ, even as you probably know, when he was crucified on his cross, were written King of the Jews, Rex Judorum in Latin, and in Greek and in Hebrew. The Greek language, the Latin language, Aramaic/Hebrew, identifying who this Jesus was. He was born into Greco-Roman culture in Palestine. And of course the world began to change because Christ not only united hearts, he united the arts. He became that which unified all of learning. And so hundreds and thousands of Greeks and Romans, pagan scholars, turn to the Christian faith and find it to be the fulfillment of their dreams and hopes. In fact, one place, Chesterton is G.K. Chesterton, who was born in 1874, died in 1936, is sparring with someone in print, and this person challenges Chesterton and says, "Let us all return to paganism." And Chesterton's response is, "Yes, let's all become pagans." They became Christians. So we have someone like Justin Martyr, who's a philosopher in the 100s, and he's like a university philosopher, and he's taking a vacation on the east coast of Asia Minor near Ephesus, and he sits with an old aged fisherman who tells him about Christos. And the short story is that he becomes a follower of Christos, but he refuses to take off his philosopher's gown because he says Christianity is the fulfillment of Greek philosophy. It's the absolute true philosophy. So we have this strange, interesting, fascinating tradition that goes back to the Greeks and Romans. It's a dramatic story. But by the time we get to Augustine in the 300s, some big questions were answered, because one of the questions was, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? The ancient Christians, as you know, were persecuted heavily at various times. But they grew and grew. The more they were persecuted, the more they multiplied, until first the lower classes, and then eventually even going up into Constantine's court and wife, and then eventually Constantine himself becomes converted. And we have a Christian emperor, and then there's this edict of tolerance. And Christianity, which was persecuted for about 3 centuries, now becomes a privileged, tolerated religion. And Augustine says, in answering the question, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? In other words, what does pagan learning have to do with the Christian faith? He answers the question. No, Tertullian asks that question first, but Augustine essentially says, we enjoy the gold that's been left for us, just the way the Hebrews enjoyed the gold when they left Egypt. And That's its own story, which I won't go into in great detail. But since then, since that time, there was a synthesis of what we now call Christendom, what we might call Christian civilization, and the educational agenda for about 1,500 years was classical Christian education. You name a great mind that was educated before 1850, say, and that person was educated this way. Here we are in Massachusetts. You think of some of the great minds. Think of the great people who came over. Think of people like, say, Jonathan Winthrop or Jonathan Edwards, to cite another Jonathan. How were these people educated? I mean, when Jonathan Edwards went to Yale, he already knew his Hebrew, his Greek, and his Latin at age 17. How could that possibly be the case? If we're going to see another Jonathan Edwards or Samuel Fuller, we're going to have to see men and women educated once again the way these men and some of the women were educated. So to return to this is to return to a cultural tradition that created much of what we now call civilization, and what we are also in many ways beginning to throw away, because we know not what we have, and we certainly know not how we got it. You know, how long does it take to build a cathedral? Who's even willing to build a cathedral? Sometimes it was generations of stonemasons working on one cathedral. It would take over 100 years to build. And they built it to last. That's why there's still 500 of them in Europe. Who would build that way anymore? You know, there's a story. You know, think of what that took just to be thinking about. You know, we're not just building a house, we're building a cathedral. To think that far down the road. We can't even think about our own death in America. Right? We're afraid of death. We push it aside. But that wasn't always the case. The generations before us were thinking of us. Let me give you an illustration. This is I looked this up. I heard one speaker mention it, and I had to look it up and see if it was true. But there's apparently some substantiation to this story, that about 20 years ago, at one of the dining clubs in Oxford University, they began to notice that the huge, many hundreds of feet, there was a huge oak beam that supported the roof. The oak beam was beginning to suffer from dry rot. It was about 500 years old. And so they were trying to figure out, how are we going to replace this big oak beam? We'd like to do it with a single piece rather than a laminate, to make it as original as possible. So they began to look through England to find some oak timber long enough. They couldn't find any. So they went to North Africa, and they couldn't find any timber. Then they finally thought, well, maybe we need to go to North America as a last resort. And during this time, there was a custodian working in the bowels of this old building who found a parchment case that had a leather case that had some parchments in it, including the plans for caring for the gardens. The parchments were 500 years old. And they came to the provost's attention, and while they were discussing what they were going to be doing, among other things, this parchment came to their attention. They began to see the building plans for the very building they were concerned about, and the agricultural and grounds plans. And they came across a passage that said this: in about 500 years, the main timber of the roof is going to begin to suffer from dry rot. But we have made provision. And it was at that time, apparently, as the story was told, the provost looks out the window, he's up in the second story, and saw these towering oak trees planted on the same grounds. Before the EPA could get involved, they cut down one of these trees. And they were able to fashion their timber. That's long-range thinking. That's thinking of the next generation. That's strategic planning. So to return to classical education is to return to a way of thinking that's very different from our own. It's not the immediate gratification. It's not the quick fix. It's not get my kid into college. Right? It's not get him a good job and a good income. It's thinking about building a cathedral, and by extension, by cultivating a civilization. Would you sign up for that? That's the call. And I don't know about you, but it's got under my skin that I got to be concerned. I want to commit my life to something greater than just the economic well-being of my 3 kids. And I want to build something beautiful that's greater than me. And I want to do it in a community with other people who think the same way. And leave something that would actually bless the coming generations. And maybe I could start to think at least 50 years down the road. Maybe I could start thinking about my grandkids. And maybe eventually, if I keep at it, I'll start thinking 500 years down the road. So I'm going to offer you, and I'm already beginning to, what I'm calling a new apology for classical education. And that's because some of you already know a good bit about it, but it's also new because you've never heard me talk before. So I hope to say something that maybe you haven't heard before. Chesterton says we come to hear people speak, hoping to hear what we don't expect to hear, right? Because if I just say what you expect to hear, you might as well just leave now. You've already heard it. So let's offer, and by apology I don't mean to say I'm sorry, but to offer a thoughtful defense about it. And to give you, an apologetic for it. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it's still something we need to hear because we leak and we need encouragement. But to know what it is that we might want to articulate and defend, we also need to be able to define it clearly. And I find again and again, classical education is hard for people to define. And you don't get it the first time you hear it. You have to keep hearing it over and over. People say this is the case also with the Christian gospel, that you have to keep hearing it. Because it's not always something that's intuitive. Sometimes it's counterintuitive. There's something weird about it, because for the last 100 years we haven't seen it. Next time I'll try to get all the water in my mouth. So I'm going to move through a few slides here. So I'd like to briefly give you a definition, a description, and a defense. And if we have some time, we'll discuss. How do you define something? To define something means to set its limits, and that's what the Latin word finis means there. We think of finish line, limits, boundary. To define something means it's concerned about limits. So how could we define it? What is it? What is it not? Some other ways of doing definition are to look at etymology, the meanings of words, or to do a comparison or an analogy. So I'm going to define classical education for you using these kinds of methods. So first I'm going to give you a couple of quick definitions. But what you're going to see is that classical education, classical Christian education, is like a multifaceted gem. It's not just one thing. And to describe the whole is of course going to leave out some description of the parts. And to describe one part at a time is going to leave something out regarding the whole. But that's just the way it is. You can't just start any other way. You have to start by looking at the whole or looking at different parts. So I'm going to give you some different definitions, and as they are layered, I think you'll see your understanding enhanced. So what have we said? Classical education, simply defined, could be the liberal arts and the great books. I think that's a good definition. The trouble is, we don't know what the liberal arts are. Nice phrase. Some of you have gone to a liberal arts college, right? But you would have trouble naming the liberal arts. Could you name them? I've talked to college professors at liberal arts colleges, and they sometimes struggle with this. Oh, what are they? Oh, yeah, I think, what is it? And well, traditionally there were 7 of them, right? You might have heard some of these: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Those 3 were sometimes called the trivium, meaning the threefold way, and they had to do with the mastery of language, because language is so important in anything a human being does. To be able to interpret well, to be able to write and speak well, clearly, briefly, accurately. Grammar is a study of how that happens. Some of us have had such grammar educations that as soon as we hear the word grammar, we want to go run and turn on a movie, because we don't think of it as anything that's really capacitated us or given us pleasure or ability. And yet that's what it's supposed to do, is to make you able to read the best that's been thought and said, and to be able to write in similar ways. When is that not helpful? Logic is the study of correct reasoning, and by implication, the study of incorrect reasoning or the fallacies. When is that not helpful? Because there's propaganda coming at you all the time, fallacies coming at you from the left, right, and center all the time. How do you sort it out? Logic studies that so that we can be protected and so that we can be cogent and compelling in our own arguments without committing fallacies and misleading people and becoming a demagogue. And then rhetoric is the third. It's the study of persuasive speaking and writing. And you can see how the three of these things together are so important: to be accurate, clear, to be compelling and cogent, and to be imaginative, captivating, and beautiful and persuasive. You can know that you can win an argument and lose the person. That's what's happening over and over again. You can logically prove something to someone. Will they change their mind? No. Logic helps you to create a great argument. Rhetoric helps you to compel people to follow. When is this not helpful? Well, those are the trivium arts, but then there are the mathematical arts that involve geometry, astronomy, music, and arithmetic, right? And they are the basis for what we do in the hard sciences, to be sure. But every human being here is a math person because you've been made in the image of God. There's not a single person who's not a math person. But the way we were taught mathematics, most of us, was such that we had to decide at some point whether we were a math person or not. And if you didn't learn as quickly as the top 20% in the class, you were made to think you were not a math person. But you are a math person. Math is a study of discrete number, number in motion, discrete shapes, and shapes in motion. That would be astronomy. In music are numbers in motion. I know that you like math because you love music. And music is mathematical. Music is an arrangement of ratios, of harmonic frequencies. And isn't it interesting that some of the mathematical ratios that we look at that characterize good music are pleasing to us mathematically, like 1-to-1, unison, 1-to-2, an octave, 1-to-3, 1-to-5, 1-to-7, a perfect fifth. All of these different ratios are pleasing mathematically. They happen for some reason to be pleasing to our ears as well. So when you hear 1-to-2 and you hear an octave, you say, I like the sound of that. But if it were 1 to 2.3678, you would say that doesn't sound good. Well, why? Why does 1 to 2 sound so good? It's interesting, and this is why the Greek philosophers and mathematicians thought that music was divine, because it was mathematically understood, and mathematics mystified them. There's so many things about mathematics that creates wonder, that's beautiful, that's mysterious and puzzling, that for about 1,000 years mathematics was done without any thinking of actual practical application, right? So we still have the division of pure and applied mathematics today because of this. Mathematics quickly turns to philosophy. Well, guess what? Mathematics is immaterial because numbers are immaterial. It's unchanging. These mathematical equations and things don't change. They're eternal. The Greeks thought they were divine, therefore. That we were talking about something divine when we were talking about mathematics. We've lost the wonder of mathematics. We don't even know what mathematicians do. Right? What do mathematicians do? They do not do endless sets of repetitive exercises at the back of a book. What does a mathematician do? We don't even know, but we do all the endless exercises at the back of a book. To what end? We don't even know. And we don't stop to puzzle and wonder and play either. Do you know what mathematicians do? They write papers. They write papers and they prove things and they explore things. Why don't we ever read their papers? Because we've got a book that we bought that tells us what to do. And it's 30 exercises a night, odd or even. Hopefully just one or the other. And you think you're not a math person. That's not your fault. So we could say the liberal arts and the great books. Well, what are the great books? And I'm on the first slide. This is the problem. The great books are the books that don't need to be written again. The great books are the books that survived. Why can you read Cicero's speeches? Why can you read Aristotle? Why could you? There are lots of other things written that we don't have anymore. Why do we have these guys? Can someone answer that question? Why do we still have the speeches of Cicero? Or Aristotle's rhetoric, or metaphysics? Yes, sir?
They were worth saving.
Exactly. Because people would copy them out before there were a printing press, right? Do you know how much it would cost to write down Aristotle's rhetoric? flock of sheep. It was expensive. They'd do it on parchment, make it last as long as possible. And professional scribes who would very carefully write these things. And do you know who recorded these things? Christian monks. Preserved pagan learning, because they saw there was something true and beautiful in Aristotle. That's why we have them. Well, what are the great books? These are the books that survived. These are the books that contain within them such great ideas that they were just passed on and became a part of what a number of people like Mortimer Adler called the Great Conversation. Great ideas that have shaped civilization, and that it's been understood that if you study these things, you're studying the greatest things that have been thought and said, and if you can become familiar with them, you will become a more capacitated and delightful and delighted human being, regardless of how much money you're going to make. The aims of the classical education were never getting the job. You know, that's setting the bar about here. Now, I'm not saying getting a good job that pays for what you need is not important. I think it is important. But that bar is set far lower than the traditional aims of the classical education, which were things like wisdom, virtue, eloquence. A life worth living. Can you imagine, men and women, if your daughter, your college daughter someday, comes home from college and says, I've met the man I'm going to marry. You'd probably be interested in the conversation. Well, tell us about him. He's a good worker. Well, what do you mean, honey? I mean, he's very functional. He's going to get a good job. And there's nothing else. Of course, you know, a good job, a good paying job is fine. But a good life it does not make. Right? A good marriage it does not make. We know this by just studying Hollywood. How many of those marriages survive? Right? You can have everything you want materially. It doesn't mean you're going to have a life well lived. And so the classical aims of education always realize this. And so the classical education was for anybody who wanted to be a human being fully alive. And it was to equip you not just for one particular vocation, but for anything you would choose to do in the future. Whether you're a plumber or a professor, you needed to read the best books that have ever been read. You needed to contemplate them, study them, and have them actually become you. Chesterton was often chided because he would quote in his books all kinds of great writers, and he'd get the citations wrong a lot. They weren't quite right. And so people would criticize it. Why didn't you look it up and get your citation right? Guess what Chesterton's response was? Why would I ever do that? Literature is supposed to be the man. If I have to go look it up, it's not mine. How far is that different from us, where we just try to out-footnote everybody and pretend like we know something? Right? Chesterton could quote from his heart and mind. You know, the educators who preceded us, they didn't just study things, they memorized things. Now we Google it. And we have become a technology. Why do I need to study history? I can Google it. Well, great. You can interrupt every conversation with a little Google check, but you don't know the causes of the Revolutionary War. You're just a pass-through. Thank you for being a pass-through, but I have my own. It's called my iPhone. I don't really need you. And then we don't need each other. And then we're not able to synthesize and actually assess and judge things because we don't really know anything. Because when we go to sleep, it's not even there, right? And we put things in and then they go out. Do you know in American education today how much is retained? Very, very little. You know this yourself because you've taken courses in college, the names of which you can't even remember, let alone the content, right? But you got the A because you got your portfolio stamp, because you never were required to really know it except for about 5 days. So you put it in your short-term memory. That's called cram, pass, forget. And it's a waste of your time. The classical education required people to actually know things. And the assessments were not by machine-readable, computer-readable tests. They were done by oral assessment and writing. And the students were filled with studium, which meant zeal. And of course, I'm speaking a bit idealistically. There were problems in the past too. Zeal after something true, good, and beautiful, such that it would become a part of them. Do you know what a commonplace book is? In the Latin used to call them, the Latin word is florilegium, and it means a book, literally a book of flowers. Before the printing press, how would you get good literature? Somebody answer that question.
Monastery.
What's that?
Monastery.
You should go to the monastery. Okay, you go into the monastery library. If you're lucky, they might let you take something out. Study it while you're there. But how do you get a book for yourself?
Hire a scribe.
Hire a scribe. Or you become your own scribe. That's the commonplace book. That's the Florilegium. You press your own flowers in these books. So if you could get around a copy of, say, Augustine's Confessions, wow. If you had a friend who was lucky enough to have one, because it costs maybe a half a flock of sheep for that short book, I don't know. But you get that, you get it. This is prized possession. You might copy long passages. You might copy as much as you can. But that could be destroyed. That could be lost so easily. Because if you lost that book, you can't go to Amazon.com and order another one and have it on your doorstep in 2 days. So what do? You memorize it. I mean, the monks would typically have to memorize the entire Psalter of 150 Psalms before they would be tonsured as monks. Of course, the memory of our classical predecessors was cultivated far beyond what we do now. People knew stuff, and to be a great orator, you didn't Google it. You didn't have notes. You memorized it. You put it in your memory palace, and you took a walk down the forum, and each pillar had a statue that reminded you of your next point. Do you think I'm walking down my memory forum right now, or in my memory palace? Not really. So they memorized great, and it became who they were. And all I'm talking about is this one definition of classical education: the liberal arts and the great books. You can start there. But get this, we don't even know why they're called liberal. We don't know what the arts are, and we don't know why they're called arts. Why are they called arts and not sciences? I don't know. I really don't know. And why are they called liberal? I don't know. This is true of people who go to liberal arts colleges and some of the teachers. Now, don't you want to know the answer? I did too. A long time ago, I was like, why are they called liberal arts? Does that mean they're not conservative arts? They're liberal? What does that mean? Well, it comes from liber means free, right? Do you know what they called children? One word for the word for children in Latin was liberi, the free ones, the ones that run around crazy at recess, right? They have a kind of freedom to them. It's a great word, liberi. But it meant freedom. And of course, we have liberty that comes from that and so forth. It was an education for the free man who could remain free and who had the free time to study these arts because he wasn't obligated to go do wage-earning work at the time. So it was considered to be a luxury to get this kind of education. And it was often, and this is why it's sometimes associated with elitism, it was often only the families that had the financial resources that could give their sons and daughters this kinds of education. But the church said, if this is the best education for a few, it's the best education for anybody. And with the invention of the printing press in around 1450, and then the Reformation, and the movement to taking this kind of education far and wide, and making everybody readers and so forth so they could access the reading of Scripture, this began to change. And the idea was everybody should have an opportunity to get this kind of education. Mortimer Adler has said the same thing. The democratization of classical education. If this is the best education for the few, don't you want your kids to get it? Where does Obama send his kids to school? Where do U.S. senators send their kids to school? The best education money can buy. If this is the best education, wouldn't we want to make it available for as many people as possible? Then they can do with it whatever they want, right? Again, whether you're a professor or a plumber, it doesn't matter. You're going to be the most interesting plumber in the world if you could have this kind of education. Seriously. Okay, so a couple others. And not the development of a child, but the formation of an adult. The classical tradition has focused on formation, not focusing on the child, although we love the child and we want to follow the child's interest to some degree. But we want to actually form fully capacitated adults. That's thinking with the end in mind. The transmission of the soul from society, from one generation to another. This is Chesterton. He's saying that the classical approach to education had in view cultural transmission. Again, like the building of the cathedral. He also said, tongue-in-cheek, it's telling the truth to the last baby born. Augustine said it's teaching children to love the things that are lovely. I wish I had time to just talk about that. Isn't that a lovely phrase? What are the lovely things? What are the things that are the true, the good, and the beautiful? Wouldn't we want to spend our time not just passing tests about them, but actually studying and knowing them so that they become who we are, that we become something like the truth. We become something like goodness. We become something like beauty. Or the cultivation of the soul on truth, goodness, and beauty. This is Platonic definition. Andrew Kern likes to use it. I love it too. The idea that we have souls that are to be cultivated, to become a great soul, is the way the Greeks thought of it. And the soul is going to be nourished and grow when it encounters and contemplates and possesses truth, goodness, and beauty, wherever it's found. So which one of these is it? Do you see the problem? You might have heard one of these definitions at one time or another. You might have heard some other definitions like, oh, it's a study of Latin and Greek, or it's a study of the Greek and Roman historical periods. Or you might have heard, oh, it's grammar, logic, and rhetoric, 3 stages of learning. And all of those things would be a part of what it is. But it's not the whole. It's all of these things at once. So therefore, I want to kind of move to a conclusion over about the next 7 or 8 minutes by talking about some analogies as well. And I'm going to skip over some slides that will probably frustrate you, but that's okay. Oh, I got to tell you this story though. I might go a little bit into my discussion time just to tell you this story. You've heard of the Pepsi Challenge? Some of you were around in the 80s when there was the Pepsi Challenge. Pepsi came up with a formula, and when they did blindfold tests, they found out that more people would choose Pepsi over Coke. And they just began to pummel Coke with this marketing campaign. More people actually like Pepsi Coke. Take the challenge yourself if you like. So Coke did take the challenge. And they replicated the same test. Yes, blindfold, take a sip of Coke, take a sip of Pepsi. More people would say that I like the Pepsi. What did Coke do? Does anyone remember? They changed the formula. New Coke. What happened? Bomb. Oh my, not... Protest in the streets, protest letters, protest songs, people hoarding cases of Coke in their basement, old Coke. And they had a terrible, and of course Coke was the dominant software drink in the world. A big global brand, of course they still are. Well, they just infuriated their own fan base. The Coke fans were happy with the old Coke. They didn't take the Coke challenge, or they did take the Pepsi challenge. They tried it. They didn't like it. They stayed with their Coke. It turned out the test was flawed. Do you know how it was flawed? If you take just a sip of Pepsi and just a sip of Coke, more of you might prefer, in this particular test, Pepsi. But if you drink a whole can, you'd prefer the Coke. Because Pepsi is sweeter, and the initial sweetness tells you, I like the sweet stuff, give me that. But when you drink a whole can, compare them, it's different. They didn't bother to test it that way. So Coke had a problem. So what did they do? You tell me what they did. Coca-Cola Classic was rolled out. The old formula was rolled out. Eventually the new Coke began to just disappear. All right. Why did they call this Coke Classic? Because something new came along. What did we call classical education before, say, around 1890, 1870? Education. The reason we call it classical is because something new came along. We're kind of stuck with this phrase, classical. It's got its pros and cons. Classis in Latin means a fleet of ships. And when a fleet would go out to battle, it would be very well organized. And so you get this idea of class, rank, and order from classis. Classy restaurant, first class, classic Coke, classic rock, right? What class are you in? We understand classic literature, classical music. It has this idea of something of enduring excellence that stood the test of time. It's going to be around. So classical education, we call it that because something new came along, but we're trying to say it's been around and it's coming around because it has been tried and proven over centuries of trial and error. And it has worked so well for so many years. But the trouble is you and I didn't get it, so we don't recognize it when we see it. Or we might intuit that there's something good when we see parts of it, but we're not sure. We got fragments of it because it's been like a shipwreck in which there are pieces floating in the water, and we grab a piece of this, a piece of that. But we haven't seen the whole vessel sailing before, right? You know, certainly not a whole fleet. But we haven't seen it in its entirety. So we are trying to rebuild the ship having never studied shipbuilding, right? We're trying to build a bridge back having to learn how to be bridge builders. Or we're trying to pull the pieces of the puzzle together when the dog ate the box top. So what does it look like? Men and women, for about 50 to 75 years, we haven't seen people, very rarely, who have been educated this way. So to begin to recover it is a challenge, and we are the generation that's rebuilding the bridge. We are the generation trying to go back, putting the pieces together. And we are stumbling and failing. Of course we are. Because we have, how do you give what you haven't received? How do we figure this out? How do we get it back? Well, it's starting to happen. It's been going on for about 30 years in little places all over the country. In the last, since 1990 or so, 1980s even, there have been some 300 classical schools that have started around, classical and Christian schools that have started around the country. Probably another 100 or 200 depending on how you count them. Count the Lutheran schools and Episcopal schools. The number of Catholic schools are starting to switch back to the classical method. There are some 125 classical charter schools that have started around the country. There are many, many thousands, probably 10 times more students being classically educated at home. And a lot of those homeschooling families are then going into the schools. A lot of these classical homeschooling families would send their kids to a local classical school if there were one nearby. So it's growing, and the internet is actually, of course, helping in many ways despite the challenges the internet sometimes provides too. It's providing great opportunities, and many, many people are now being educated this way. It's growing every year. The colleges are beginning to start aligning. Colleges like Gordon College and many others have dialed into this because, you know why? Students coming to these colleges who are just remarkable students. And let me just tell you about these students. They may be remarkable by our standards now, but they're not remarkable by historic standards. They're not remarkable if you compare them to Jonathan Edwards. Now, Jonathan Edwards was probably a genius, so we probably don't want to compare anybody to Jonathan Edwards. Okay, but the point being, we think we're doing so well, but we're just in the first stage of recovery. What took 2 or more generations to lose is going to take 2 or more generations to recover. So we need to be patient. Am I about out of time? Okay, so then I'll close with this. The students who are getting this kind of education are nonetheless doing some remarkable things. There are students now, these, you know, some people will say, well, the kids are classically educated, they're obviously not going into the sciences. Well, you're wrong. About 40% of them go into the hard sciences. In my daughter's class, about half of the kids who graduated from our school in Harrisburg went on into the hard sciences. Medical school, physical therapy. One guy's designing apps for a company that works for Apple and so on. One famous chemistry professor said about a century or more ago, give me the student who's learned his Latin and I'll be responsible for his chemistry. Because he noted that the classically educated kids would at first be not as strong in the sciences as the kids who had a very specialized scientific education. But within about 2 years, they would surpass all of the kids who had that specialized education. The great scientists of the 17 and 1800s were all classically educated, right up to Einstein and so forth. So the students are becoming the great hope. They're the ones who, as we slowly are putting these pieces together, slowly creating this bridge back and getting kids to walk across it and walk back to these wonderful, refreshing waters that come from the classical tradition, they are growing wise and stronger than we were when we were their age. And their kids have a chance of growing even more so. They're the great hopes. They're the ones who are actually the greatest walking advertisements for what we're doing. And you're thinking about doing a high school at Samuel Fuller. I encourage you to finish the painting, to finish the picture. The last 4 years are actually the hardest part, but they're also the most rewarding part. The reason they're hardest, these kids are getting smarter. They're getting smarter than we are. It's hard to find the teachers who can teach them well. And it's also the case that parents are starting to think, this class that's got 15 kids in it, how can that be a high school? Do you know that 100 years ago, all of the great minds in this country were educated in small high schools? They were all neighborhood schools that you could walk to, with teachers who would teach generations of kids, at least a couple, right? Small was always considered to be good. In fact, best. If you want to go to Oxford University, if you could get in, good luck. If you could pay for it, good luck. You'll be tutored. One professor for every 2 students. That's small education. It's considered to be the best in the world. The tutorial is the highest form of education. Small classes with gifted teachers who actually know and love their kids and are interacting with them at the most personal levels. That's the highest form of education. And you want to send your kid to a public school, would graduate with 500 kids with 35 to 40 kids a class? Or would you rather go to Oxford? So it's actually academically superior to get involved in what we would call a seminar or a tutorial just as fast as you possibly can and get out of the big classes. So we're seeing that, and I have to stop with this illustration. I'm going into my discussion time. But I got to close with this. So when we were graduating our first high school class, everybody's wondering what's going to happen with these kids. Nervous parents. We had 6 graduates years ago with our first graduating class of seniors. What are they going to do? We're in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. There's numerous big, huge public high schools that have, classes of 3 or 4 or 500. We had a class of 6. How are they going to do on the PSAT? How are they going to do on the SAT? Are they going to get into a good college? And I would say things like, well, the other schools that are ahead of us, their kids are doing just fine. I'm sure ours are going to do fine as well, but we'll see. And of course, we're praying like crazy, working like crazy. And going with those pioneers who are willing to be with us those 6 years, experimenting on them, as it were, giving them the very best we could. Well, of those 6 kids, 3 of them were national merit finalists. Right? No, 2 national finalists, 1 recommended scholar. Of the entire East Shore of Harrisburg, where there are 2 massive high schools, we took 50% of the national merit finalists in that class of 6. So we began to boast that, 50% of our graduates are... And it got to the point where we realized that the scores were laughable, that the classical curriculum was so good at preparing students in math and reading and writing, which is what the SAT tests, that we didn't even have to teach to the test. And that's been true year after year. The average SAT score at this school in the verbal and math is just under 1,400. And some of these kids are clearly average kids who've just worked diligently for 12 years. So the SAT, and you can see this on the ACCS website, you can see the stats. That's not going to be your concern. Your concern is going to be who's willing to be the first class to break the ice. Who's going to be the one to blaze the trail? Who wants that experience? We'll talk about that during our discussion time, I'm sure. But let me close with that, and we'll take a break and get some coffee, continue eating your dessert, or eat mine. Thank you very much. Can we move right into a Q&A? Can we move right into a question and answer time? Okay. So we can go right into a Q&A time. So please push back with your questions, concerns, and your comments. Who'll be the brave pioneer? Who's going to break the ice? If you don't ask questions, I'm going to ask questions for you and answer them myself. Yes, Dan.
How do you find the teachers for as we're looking at to get high school up and running? If we didn't have, obviously, as it grows, classes grow with teachers.
Great, great question. And feel free, like some are, get a cup of coffee, walk around. I won't be disturbed. You won't be disrespecting me at all if you want to get something else. The question Dan asked is, how do you find good teachers for the high school? The short answer is it's getting better. It's getting better because there are more students now who have been through this kind of education already and are coming back to these schools, want to be a part of them. So there are a number of, and I can cite schools like even our own where graduates have come back to be teachers. So that's good. And there are colleges that are starting to align themselves with this renewal in a significant way. That's some other really encouraging news. I could cite to you, I could just rattle off about 15 or 20 colleges: Baylor, Gordon, Calvin, Wheaton, Biola, etc., Houston Baptist, Patrick Henry, Messiah, others that are dialed right into this because of the graduates coming to their colleges, and they're saying, how do we create programs that will attract them because we want more of these students? The students are their own advertisement. And then the college admissions officers come knocking on the door. This was astounding to me. After our first 6 graduates, they all got scholarships to wherever they went. After that, we started getting calls from admissions counselors from around the country. Houghton wanted to send an admissions counselor to our school for a day to meet with the next 8 or 10 seniors. And wanted to sell, because 2 of our students had gone to Houghton, they were like, who are these kids? Where did they come from? Well, let's go to that school. Maybe there's more of them. And so we were this little school graduating just, eventually 15, 18 graduates a year, and the colleges come knocking, even to these small schools. So that's good. That means that the programming at the colleges is starting to be geared. Grove City, where's Julie? Because Julie went to Grove City, so did my daughter. Julie was a few years ahead of my daughter. And Grove City said they started seeing this happening. And they said, we need to create some programs for these classical kids. And there's a history of philosophy of history professor there named Jason Edwards said, we need to create a program and we need to create an internship for students who want to go into classical schools to actually go intern at a classical school in the region, so they'll be well trained before they get hired. So they're trying to create teachers for you. There's one over there, although the program was created a little after she left. And that's really exciting. And more schools are starting to do the same thing. Biola is definitely doing this. The Torrey Institute Biola, the Great Text Program at Baylor. Colleges are starting the Jerusalem and Athens program at Gordon College. The Gordon and Orvieto program at Gordon College is very friendly to classical students. So it's just, and I get calls about a couple of months from another college. Could we talk to you about what's going on in classical education? And not only am I getting these calls, but other people who are part of the renewal. So it's getting better. But you want to look for people who have a passion for education, love kids, and have a passion for the arts they've been trained in, and hopefully are multidisciplinary. It really bothers me. It makes me envious when I meet some of these young teachers who, know Latin, maybe French or something too, study history or English. Oh, and they're really good at calculus. Come on. Those people should just go away. But they're becoming like the medieval teachers who are masters of the arts, all of them. Before you could get a license in the Middle Ages to teach, you had to have mastered all 7 of those arts. They can integrate. They integrate on the fly. They are integrated human beings themselves. But we've had such a fragmented education, we think you have to have a specialized major in order to be qualified as a teacher. I won't go on that rant, but that's what you're looking for. Who's next? Yes, Mark.
In founding the school and now where you are today, what were some of the challenges early on, some of the biggest challenges, and what are your challenges now that you still face?
Okay, great. So I was the founding headmaster at this school in Harrisburg from 97 to 2007, before I went full-time into consulting and publishing. The challenges were as follows. I was talking to Peggy about this beforehand. When kids get to be about 8th grade, they now have a vote in their family, for better or worse. So the kid gets a say in where he gets to go to school. So that becomes a problem, because if for some reason a capricious kid says, you know what, I think I want to play soccer at the public high school, I want to try out for the soccer team. It says that mom and dad might say, well, okay, I guess you should go try play soccer at the public high school. Okay. And he leaves your school. that happens. So I'm saying whatever the kid's thinking becomes more determinative. Secondly, we were just imprinted by our own high school experiences, right? You kind of came of age at about 16, 17, or 18, and you might be thinking the football games, the prom, crazy joyrides, hanging out with the guys, staying up all night, or whatever comes to mind when you think of your high school, the locker, the lockers along the hallway and so forth, the group you hang out with, the car you fixed up, whatever it might be, your first girlfriend. You start thinking, isn't that what it's supposed to be for my kid? And how many kids are going to be in that graduating class at Samuel Fuller? Did you say 7, maybe? And one of them might be leaving. How can I tell my son that that's where he's going to graduate? Doesn't seem to fit our deeply imprinted idea and maybe our unconscious ideals of what a high school should be. So that's a problem. So there's this kind of exit ramp at about 9th grade, 10th grade, so forth. And for some it's athletics. Some, these small schools will not have football teams. Now there are some of the classical schools that do, like the Regent School of Austin has a great football team. But that's not typical because you need a larger student body to do that. So what they do, though, as a small school, they do exceedingly well. So there's a kind of trade here. You're not going to play football at Samuel Fuller, and then get a scholarship, to Boston U to play quarterback or something. That probably won't be in your son's future. Can you live with that? Well, I don't know. I think I want to give him a shot. He's got a good arm. So I don't know. And especially if you played football like I did. My dad played for Cal. Started for Cal, and my grandfather started for Cal. I better play football. Well, I didn't. My dad was a lot better athlete than I was. But we have these kind of ideals. They start influencing what we think. But here's what the small schools do that's remarkable. Let me tell you this. There's a school down in Virginia called Advante School near D.C. It has a high school of about 50 or 60 students. About 5 years ago, they decided to start a mock trial team. Now, they're studying grammar, logic, and rhetoric, great literature, right? They know how to debate. They know how to speak. They're studying that all the time. They start a mock trial team. Well, they go and they compete. Small little high school. They go to a tournament. They win one round. They lose one round. End of the year. The next year, they win the state of Virginia. The year after that, they win the state of Virginia. The year after that, they win the state of Virginia. 3 years running. They become like the big mock trial team that everybody in the entire state of Virginia is gunning for. But why did they do that? Well, because in Idaho, the mock trial team that has won for the last 12 years in a row is from a high school that has less than 100 students. It's called Logos School in Moscow, Idaho. And it's won the state championship of Idaho for 11 out of 12 years, except for 1 year, 3 years ago, when it got beat by the Ambrose School from Boise, Idaho, another classical Christian school. So these small schools can do some remarkable things. But you have to choose what you do with the curriculum that you have and the size school that you have. So, but it's been a temptation. The sports or a big drama program, the public schools are going to offer those things. And your parents are going to be tempted to take the exit ramp because they want to give their kids a shot at something like that. That means you're going to have a group of pioneers who are willing to go with you, and there'll be some disappointments. There will be people you think are going to be with you who will fall off. And then there'll be people you think, I don't think they're going to be here for a year. And they stay with you the whole way, and they get more and more excited. You're just going to have these different kinds and everything in between. You can't really predict what people are going to do. You can predict to some degree. I hope I can predict what you're going to do, Mark, with your kiddos. But it takes some parents and some kids. I'll tell you another story about this. The current president of the board at Covenant Christian Academy in Harrisburg, a very good friend of mine, and his last of 4 sons is graduating this year. And his son, Greg, is a very talented basketball player himself, and he taught all his 4 sons to play basketball. They were all very good, 2 of them exceptionally good, 1 good enough to play college. And he was also the basketball coach. At one time, he had 3 of his sons starting on our basketball team. And with almost each of his kids, at one time or another, these kids came to Greg and said, Greg, Dad, Greg, Dad, do you mind if I call you Greg? Dad, I want to go to the public high school where I can, because I think I could start on the big CV team, Cumberland Valley with a big high school in the area. And Greg said, That's never going to be an option in this household. I mean, from the very beginning, he was very clear. This is going to be the best education. It's going to prepare you for a lot of other things in life. And college basketball, as fun as that might be, it's very rare that you'd even make a college team, and you certainly won't make the NBA. So what really is going to count? But Dad, I think maybe I could get into the NBA. No, son, you're not going to get into the NBA. And that was his, and then each of his sons, not too long after, or however long it took, came to him and said, Dad, thanks so much for keeping me at this school. And those boys became just like stalwarts at the school. They became kind of anchors at the school when they decided this is going to be our school. Another thing you need to do is you need to encourage the kids to own the school. As they go, and you know, one headmaster I really respect, who I think is very wise, says that the key to your upper school is 7th grade boys. Because those 7th grade boys are so malleable and willing to be led that if you lead them well and you cultivate them to love the aims and goals of the school, they will become the rocks that take your school all the way to the end. You've got to start with 7th grade boys. You're going to be developing them, and they will lead their class, then they'll eventually be leading the entire school. I thought that was an interesting comment. But what we often do is we start talking to these kids as if they're consumers. Like, oh yeah, we're going to do something for you. It won't be too long before we'll be having a basketball team. We'll do cross country. Would that be okay? And hey, you know, you're still going to stay with us because we're trying to do everything we can. You want some coffee? We'll start doing coffee here. And these kids are like, yeah. So what you going to do for me? What you going to do for me here? Because I could go over there, right? What are you going to do for me? Because I could switch companies. And instead, we need to appeal them not as consumers, but as creators and contributors and participants and partners, and say, this is your school, and you can actually be trained in leadership if you help develop the school as a pioneer. You want to sign up for that? That's what they do in the Marines. You lead other people. Do you want to lead or what? Or do you want to just go become a part of some big group? And of course, not everybody will go for that, but some will. And they'll say, I want to be one of the few, the proud, the Samuel Fuller graduate. And you go with those guys, and you edify them, and you let them blaze the trail for you. And then you let them be the one who sells the school to the lower school. This is a mistake we often make. Thank you. We get up and sell the school because I'm paid to do so, right? And so we're not a credible source. You know, when Aaliyah gets up and says, I want to tell you about how great our high school is going to be. Oh, it's wonderful. Oh, yeah, right. Of course, there's so much of you that's tied into that. But when the kids get up and start saying, here's what our school is about. Here's what it means to me. And we start bringing your alumni back. I know a school in Virginia, they turned the promotion of the upper school completely over to the students themselves. When you come to an information night, the upper school principal, this is Lance Collins down at New Covenant Schools, would just be like the host and the facilitator. And he let the kids say everything. And they would prepare. The alumni would come and they'd have panels. And they're believable. And then the kids start making a choice of whether or not they want to actually help create the school rather than just consume it. Okay. The hardest thing to do the last 4 years, but the most exciting thing. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Anybody else? You couldn't tell that was kind of wrapped up inside him and had to come out. And Mark just hit the button. Anything else concerns you before we leave? I'll have to give you a short answer, I promise you. But
Oh, that's good enough.
all right, Dan, take us home.
What's your viewpoint on physical education in classical schools?
Physical education. We were chatting about this a little bit at dinner. Physical education is really integral to the whole classical tradition because it was understood or it was learned that the body and the mind work together. You know that psychosomatic kind of relationship. We just, you grammar school teachers know that when the kids go run around at recess, they're ready afterwards, they do math better, right? There's something that happens when you just exercise. And it goes all the way back to the Greeks who realized that boys needed to wrestle together. They would wrestle almost every day outside, and then they would wrestle inside the classroom as well. The wrestling they're kind of a mirror image in the class and outside of the class. Because you do intellectual wrestling as well with your friends and comrades. And that's really very important, especially by the time you get to dialectic age or junior high age. So physical education is tied into the training of the body, but Plato said it's the training of the body, it corresponds to the tuning of the heart. So what we do with our bodies has a lot to do with where our souls or minds go, follow. I was talking to the staff a little bit about this. This is a corollary to physical education. We need to embody what we do, not just talk about it with text. We have a highly verbal form of education, which is good, but it's not sufficient. We need, in addition to text and speech, to actually come to know things through sound and things that we see. Beautiful art, for example, and great and beautiful music, even good food, are all a part of the metaphor of what it means to actually grow and be fed as a human being. We need a feast for our ears, a feast for our eyes, a feast for our tongues as well. And our American schools are drab, men and women. They're drab. They architecturally resemble more than anything else a what? A prison. Long hall, they're efficient. Casement windows that don't open, fluorescent lights, polished floors, buzz doors, beeps and sounds, right? Rectangles in rooms in a row. They really do resemble architecturally the prison, whereas before in the classical tradition we would build a school around a garden, usually a courtyard in a monastic fashion, with a breezeway, with beautiful art, connected to a beautiful dining area with paintings where people would eat while they were being read to. Well, just think of how we eat in schools today, right? Dan and I were joking about it. You might as well just bring a teacher into a big, big room. It's basically like herding cattle in there. You better arm that teacher with some kind of a weapon to keep everybody in line. Usually it's a loud microphone. Kids, it's time to bring down your voices, please. Lower your voices, thank you. I mean, I've done that in my past. Table 6, you're out of line. I need you to quiet down. You'll be dismissed to recess last if that continues. And it's just, but instead, why couldn't it be something similar to this? Why don't we have table settings? Why don't we have tablecloths? And so there are schools that realize this. They say, our lunch is a lost opportunity. Teachers are just trying to get a break. They want to get into their room and do some planning. Who cares if the kids eat themselves as well as their lunches? We just need a break. But some of the worst things that happen at lunch. Is where the cliques occur, the gossip occurs, the meanness occurs. And we've got one teacher or parent patrolling the edges just to keep the kids from killing themselves. And we're not thinking about embodying. And eating is a time of community and conversation. So guess what one school did? I got to stop, I know. Put labels on each table, conversation topics. And would ask for teacher volunteers or parent volunteers to sit at the various tables. And they put down tablecloths and table settings. And so you go seat yourself based on the conversation topic. So over here it says fairy tales. Over here it says Roman weapons of war. And there's Mr. Johnson, the ancient history teacher. He's ready for a conversation. You know what happens. And then things get better. You're just thinking, what about these student musicians we're training? Perfect time for them to play music. Guitarists and pianists and others, they're playing music for you while you're dining. And they get to practice their art. Hey, that's a good idea. Reading lunches. What if we said the first 15 minutes, the headmaster is going to come in and read a really great book. I used to read P.D. Wodehouse. All right, read some comedy, some light comedy. I remember reading The Smile That Wins and so on. And the kids were like, the headmaster is reading this British comic? What's going on? We would surprise them. Sometimes we'd read something a little more edifying, but we did reading lunches in various ways. So what we do with the body is so very important. I want to thank all of you for coming. The 3 schools that are represented here. It's just so great to have 3 classical schools at once. I was just talking to Stephen about the possibility of a regional conference in New England so that all of you guys could come together for a couple of days, right, and really talk instead of having to figure out how to fly to Dallas or wherever the conference is going to be. So let's get that conversation going, and maybe we can figure out how in the next year or so to do something regionally here for your schools. I just pray that you guys would stay with it and thrive and grow. New England needs to return to the roots. This is where it started, right? And you have an honored position because of that, and you're the ones who can help us to return. So God bless you, and thank you for your time tonight. Can't eat this cake.